Fans, we are live once again with another edition of the Cheap Heat Productions Pro Wrestling Podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling. Very pleased tonight to offer a couple of special guests. The first being a man who had a significant career in the professional wrestling industry. Well known from his tenure as an on-air personality in the Attitude Era during the WWF reign during that time, ROH, Japan, and most recently in AEW, along with his co-host, Mr. Casey Thompson, of the new podcast that they're debuting called the In Ring Podcast. We're going to get into all of the information behind the formulation and promulgation of this podcast. But before I do that, as per the tradition, I would like to introduce Mr. Cheap Heat himself, the man who is a tireless public servant, although an injured public servant today, Mr. Morris Shortle. Morris, welcome to your show.
Yeah, I'd just like to clear up. I think Casey thought that it might have involved Jemison, but just to clear the record, it happened during the day, very early in the morning. No Jemison involved. But if it would have happened late at night, Jemison may have been involved, but not this time.
I just wasn't sure.
Yeah, that's fine.
These accidents do happen. Well, welcome, gentlemen, to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here with both you guys and with Casey, and just getting this podcast going. It brings back a lot of memories for both of us for different things. Like I'm not. As we're going along, I'm learning things and I'm remembering things. So there's some things that like Casey remembers. There's things that I remember, and it all just comes together. We just we got in the business almost at the same time down in Florida, and we have so many common friends. We've been friends for all these years, and it's just been great.
Can we get the story then of how you guys met initially? Whichever guy wants to take that.
Casey, was it IWF that I first met you?
Yeah, it was IWF back when Eddie Mansfield was running the IWF out of Universal Studios, the original Soundstage 23. I was one of Blackjack Mulligan's boys, so he asked me to come and do some of the TV stuff, and I was doing WCW at the same time, and I was concerned that I was going to get some heat because Flair and guys like that had a lot of heat with Eddie Mansfield for the 2020 episode and everything. So I told Jack, I said, if I can wrestle under a mask, under a hood, I said, not a problem, I'll do it. He's like, yeah, no problem. So, and that's where I met Kevin at. And now it's 30 years later.
Yeah. Eddie Mansfield had a lot of heat with a lot of people. He was the guy that gave me my first break in wrestling. And actually, it was Casey's longtime tag partner that gave me my first shot in wrestling. So, our roads are linked up. Yeah, because it was Cliff Anderson who called the radio station I was working at and was looking for a ring announcer. And I ripped the phone out of the woman's hand who answered it and said, "Ring announcer? That would be me, sir. I would love to be it."
Yeah, that was definitely one of the initial questions that we had for you, and that is working for Eddie Mansfield and his heat for exposing the business. Was that something that when you're commencing your career, Kevin, that really gave you pause to consider? And did you, in terms of negating future opportunities, or did you ever get any negative feedback as a result of your association with Mr. Mansfield?
No, never. And nobody ever said anything to my face, not once. And I was never told that I was denied a job because of it. I mean, I got to work for the WWF. I broke in and I started in 1991, and they were looking for me because I had sent a tape in, and Bruce Pritchard was looking for me, but I had moved, so I had changed my phone number. And it was when Billy Gunn asked. I asked him, I said, "Hey, ask if they need a local ring announcer for this upcoming loop of Florida house shows." And he mentioned it to Bruce, and Bruce said, "Kevin Kelly, the guy you worked with down there in Florida?" "Yeah." oh, we've been looking for him. Have him call me and we'll get it all squared up. So, yeah, no, nobody ever said anything to me about it. I mean, it was weird because Eddie Mansfield he was my color commentary partner and he was the Continental lover. He never wanted to be called Eddie Mansfield. And I think that was obviously because he either owed people money or didn't want any negative publicity on the show.
But also by that time, the WWF has already exposed the business so many times over and over, so it didn't matter. I was in WCW where it was all the old school guys like Flair and guys like that really had an issue with it. I mean, I would hear the grumblings when I was going up to do TV at Center Stage, different places like that. And so I knew that it was going to be like a heat on my back as soon as they see my face on that TV and realized it. And back in those days, I was getting enough squash matches. I didn't need any more. I was doing well enough on my own. So I told Jack, I said, you put the hood on me. I said, because some of those guys, they had great bodies and just couldn't work a lick. So, or they'd read literally, I remember wrestling Thunder and Lightning, and they were literally reading out of a spiral notebook to me then next you will duck our clothesline and this. I looked at Jack and I'm like, what the? And he's like, looked at me, he said, you be all right, big case. I'm like, so, but yeah, so, but yeah, it's, it just, that was my concern. And he, the wearing the mask took care of it.
They predicted the future, though, reading out of a notebook, didn't they, back then?
Yeah, I mean, they really did. And again, it was the business regressing because the number of veterans who could call matches in the ring and, call it on the fly began to reduce. And generationally, it's just like everything else. Generationally, we get dumber, right? And I think, the wrestling business succumbed to that as well. And guys, I remember Dr. Tom and Lance Storm having the philosophical disagreement. Lance Storm was, we should just teach them how to memorize matches. And Dr. Tom was, we need to teach them how to call it on the fly in case their memorized match gets cut short. And what to do in case of that. So it just goes back and forth with where you are generationally.
And also, I think it has a lot of differences is they're doing TV. It's a TV program. So there's no worry about the crowd reaction. They don't care about, I've seen live shows where they've done 20 minutes of pre-tape or stuff in the back and the crowd's just sitting out there just like doing nothing. So they don't care about the crowd. They care about the millions that are watching on TV. So
that is true.
For them to call it on the fly and stuff like that, they'd rather have them nowadays, especially, WrestleMania, they'll get the whole entire hotel and bring the ring in and they rehearse for the whole week for that match. My day, you tell me a spot one time, it could have 30 different things in it, and I could tell it to you backwards because I just had a memory where I could remember everything, go forward and backwards. I wrestled like Buff Bagwell, and he's like, oh, man, what's the spot? I'm like, in the ring, I'm like, it's your match, bro. You should have remembered it. And I just take over and start beating on him. I'm like, remember your spot. You called it. A lot of guys, Flying Brian, when he first started, he would go over his matches in the back like half the afternoon. And it's like, can't you just call it out in the ring? And the other guys are like, hey, what do you want to do? It's like, let's just call it out there. I'm like, okay.
And here's a modern, a today example of the issue that happens with it. And it's one of the issues that I think AEW negatively. The guys get to the building at 1:00 and they know that they need to completely script out their match so that they can tell their coach and the coach can then relay it to the truck shot for shot. Hey, he's going to do a dive out on the ramp side. Hey, he's going to do a plancha on the hard camera side, whatever. So this way they have the camera set up the way they need him to be. But because they're memorizing it they're also it and adding stuff to it all day. So it becomes like this big, it's 10 pounds of crap in a 5-pound bag. And instead of just going out there with a framework, here's we're going to start this way, here's the heat spot, and this is what we want for a finish, it becomes this scripted drama that just becomes, a Michael Bay film by the time it's all finished. And especially the Ring of Honor matches, because those guys go on after all the, whether it's Collision or Dynamite or whatever. And so they even have longer, even though they're finding out their matches kind of late, but some of them know early, hey, you're wrestling so-and-so in ROH tonight. They have 8 hours to plan. And those matches become like crazy. And so that's one of the issues that you get with it. We want to get all of our stuff in. No, not because of any nefarious reason. We want to get all of our stuff in because we thought of these ideas, and this is how we have the match memorized. It's easier to add than to edit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, having been to numerous AEW shows this year. But you brought up AEW, which we're going to talk about in a bit, but it's germane that you did, because I wanted to get your assessment. A lot of fan criticism towards that product right now, from A to Z. You having been there in the recent past, is it accurate, in your opinion, that the stranglehold that Tony Khan has on the creative is the downfall of that product, or is it a more nuanced set of issues?
I'll take the other side of the coin. It's easy to point the finger of blame at the guy who is at the head of the creative. But let's look at what they have right in front of them now and look at it organizationally from a sports perspective. They have a ton of injuries. And they also have had a lot of, between Sting and Bryan Danielson, retirements. Edge, injured. Eddie Kingston, injured. What about the Guns? I think one of them is all injured. You can go up and down the roster and you can point at injuries. Now, injuries in sports are never an excuse for a team not winning. And ultimately, the blame does fall on the general manager and the coach. And in this case, the GM and coach and owner and everything is Tony Khan. But it's like Jerry Jones with the Cowboys. He's not going to fire himself. So I think that there are a lot of factors involved other than just Tony has gotten burned out or stale or, whatever criticism I've read. There's a lot more to it than that. But again, when you're everything to a company and you don't delegate, then you're left with, who to blame and who to point the finger at is the guy in the mirror.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that yourself, Casey, and compared to when you broke into the business? And people like you worked in WCW, will say, and people online try to mirror WCW with AEW at times. You see any comparison in there at all?
Well, they're on the same networks. Yeah. Wrestling evolves, it evolves from the 60s and 70s to the 80s. You look back at some of the 80 wrestlers and you watch their matches and you're like, wow, yeah, it was compelling. It drew you in and everything. But I'm like, I watched it as a kid, but I watch it now. I'm like, those guys weren't that good, athletically. Now, wrestling keeps evolving, and now it's evolving even more. And it's not my type of wrestling, but, it's for somebody, which seems to be about 500,000 people a week, according to their ratings, if I'm correct, somewhere in that ballpark. So, yeah, when I ran my promotion, I sprinkled a little bit of everything in there. That way everyone out there watching could get a little a little happy of like, okay, yeah, that was good. That little hardcore when hardcore was big, a little old school, a little new wrestling, a little strong style, flippy floppity stuff, a little of everything instead of just all one daredevil move after another. And then you look at it like Kevin was just saying, a quarter of the roster is on the injured list. The stuff they're doing now, you know, I wrestled 20 years and I know how I feel when I get out of bed, and I didn't do half the stuff they're doing. So what's their, they say a bump card, and that's a true fact. You have only so many bumps in that bump card. And then once people are like, hey, you want to get back in the ring? I'm like, no, I don't. Absolutely not. I have no desire to ever hit a rope again or take a bump, because I punched my numbers in my bump card. So wrestling evolves, and it's for somebody, and they're building, but it's just not my style of wrestling. But I'm not gonna put them down or whatever. I know they have some great people behind the scenes. I know a lot of them. Are they listening to them? Um, just from what my perspective is, I don't think they're listening to what some of their agents are telling, because their agents don't wrestle that way or never did wrestle that way. Some of their agents are some of the best guys to ever step into the ring. So there's no way they're listening to them when they're giving them, constructive criticism about the matches or not. So that's just, how I see it.
Yeah,
And then there's the situation like with three guys that are kind of in AEW witness protection right now: Wardlow, Ricky Starks, and to a lesser extent, Willie Hobbs, who just came back off a knee. So those were three guys that were figured in from pretty much the beginning, and right now are a non-factor in terms of any main storyline, but they're not open and honest with the audience about that. In the NFL, if you have 3-star players who are either holding out in contract negotiations or soon to be free agents, we all know it. And that's where either you're all in or you're all out. What are we? And I think they've blurred the lines so much that the audience has lost some faith in what they've done. And obviously CM Punk was a big, big departure that we cannot minimize or negate. The Young Bucks are they on their way out? Kenny Omega has been out for over a year. All of these different scenarios. There's a lot that's going into it that is affecting the company. And Vince decided in 1997, when Bret Hart left, to start shooting with the audience, because the real story was better than the fake story. And I think that might be the case with AEW right now. And that would be, if I had a suggestion, I would say just shoot with it. Just be honest. Let's go. What do we have to lose? Who cares? Audiences down where they were a couple of years ago. There's a reason for that. And it's not ticket prices or lack of promotion. What is it?
Yeah, to move away from AEW just for a second, a lot of fans sent in questions, Kevin, about perhaps the most infamous angle of the Attitude Era, and I don't think that's a stretch. And that's the whole
Mark Henry, and Johnny Mae Young and giving birth to a hand, right?
That's definitely in the top 5. But I was speaking, of course, of Pillman's Got a Gun, and they wanted to hear about the soup to nuts of how such a thing, even in the Attitude Era, was pitched, executed, and then the aftermath from your perspective as a key player in it.
Well, I think that this was all the doing of Brian Pillman, from the creative, from the beginning stages of it, and all had to do with his ankle still being messed up, his foot never recovering from the car accident and the surgery that he had, and having to go back in and have more surgery. Obviously, as a way to get heat on Steve Austin, they had him Pillmanize the ankle, which has become now a verb in wrestling, but he was the first one that did it. And then So the week before, I had gone on location to a Sunday house show and recorded an element of Bret Hart and Steve Austin fighting. But it was as of, we were supposed to be live on the air on Raw, but we actually shot it the night before. So Vince was impressed, and Vince said, let's send Kevin to do the Pillman thing. And so we go to Pillman's house in Erlanger, Kentucky, right outside of Cincinnati's, greater Cincinnati area. And it just had like kind of a sad feel around the whole house, because I think Brian was messed up physically and mentally, down in the dumps. The house looked like really nobody was taking care of it or doing anything with it. And it was a lot of milling around during the day. Those two guys, he and Steve, figuring some stuff out. But it was all going to be live. So anything could happen when you're live. And I pre-taped the first little thing outside. We're standing outside the house of Brian Pillman here in Erlanger, Kentucky, and blah, 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 blah. And Steve Austin has threatened to show up and finish the job on Brian Pillman, a very old school angle, but with a new school twist. And obviously his gun was a real gun. And so USA was none too pleased. And our international television partners were none too pleased. And so we fly back that night thinking, high-fiving, thinking we did a great job. And the first person that I see when I walk into the TV studio that next day was Tommy Carlucci. And Tommy, at the time, was the head of international television production. And he says, what are you doing to me? You're killing me. I'm like, what? Oh, the gun thing. Yeah. Great. Now I've got to re-edit the show. And he was on the phone, all morning with every television outlet that our shows aired on, because they all heard about it. And Vince having to do his mea culpas. Oh, it was a starter's pistol. No, it wasn't. So it was one of those things that we asked for forgiveness instead of permission, because it never would have been granted. And again, it was part of that wild time where Vince was competing against WCW and was doing anything he could to try to bridge the gap, try to close the distance between the two companies, because at the time, WCW was kicking Vince's ass. And it had started to turn. It was starting to turn, but it was still a ways away. And, we would put out this really cool, edgy show and all these different things in it. We'd get the ratings the next day, and it would be hardly any movement at all. And because ratings move at a glacial pace. But once they get going, it's like turning a ship around. It takes a long time for it to get going in one direction, and a long time for it to turn the other way. And it never did. It never could for WCW, because by then their brand was forever ruined by all of their missteps. And WWF had seized control and kept a stranglehold on it until they eventually bought the company for a couple $1 million.
Yeah, that was a pretty crazy thing to happen on screen. Casey Thompson, as someone in the locker room, what's the craziest thing that you've seen backstage off screen, either in WCW or WWF?
Oh, wow. I mean, besides Orndorff, knocking out Vader.
In flip-flops.
That's the top. Yeah, in flip-flops. Yeah, Paul always wore his flip-flops. So they in WWF always had all the agents all had tennis shoes on, and not in WCW is flip-flops, except for Tony Schiavone. That has to be the top of it, the craziest thing. I've seen a lot of things. The Steiners taping Juventud to the chair. All the Mexicans all got taped to the chairs and stuffed in lockers. I mean, literally duct taped like a mummy. All that kind of stuff. So you've seen a lot of crazy stuff.
And to follow up on that, Casey, as a WCW fan from that era, really appreciated the Saturday night program. I've had an opportunity to interview a lot of guys that worked center stage in Atlanta, and they describe the atmosphere there as being unique, so to speak, as well as
that's a
chaotic.
good adjective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
chaotic backstage. So I wanted to get your insights on what that was like for you, aside
Right,
from the more other stuff.
so center stage was freezing cold in the wintertime. All right, so it is very small, in very small hallways. They couldn't get anyone in the building, so they would literally have the hey, there's Kevin. You'd literally have they would give the homeless people t-shirts from the warehouse to wear, the gimmick shirts. They'd give them free meal, but they wouldn't give them the meal until after the taping was over. And they taped back then. They taped 4 weeks at a time in one night, so they had like 60, job matches, you know, in one night, and a couple of good matches. So, and it had the worst catering. Not the worst, but I mean, WCW never had really good catering at all. Um, it got worse as time went on, but like. We'd go upstairs and eat, but yeah, it was just in a bad area. It was just no one wanted to ever be there. It was just miserable. No one was happy to be there. When I seen, it was always a double shot. Center stage, Montgomery, Alabama. Center stage, Anderson, South Carolina. Center stage, Perry, Georgia. We'd always hope it would be center stage and then something because we're coming from Florida, so we're hoping it's somewhere south. But we'll be closer, we can get home faster. But yeah, yeah, it wasn't no one's favorite building. Looking back at it, I'm really glad that I worked there because I won't say it's like the holy grail of buildings like Madison Square Garden or things like that, but it is a pivotal building in television wrestling, because so much was done there. So yeah, I wrestled a lot of matches there. You know, froze my ass off a lot there. So
And I know from my point of view, because, and I don't think, Casey, I don't know if you were there. Were you there when I got my WCW audition and I was warming up
no,
the crowd at MGM? So it was in May of '96, and Herb Hennessy helped set it up for me.
okay,
And I was the yay boo guy. So those crowds that came in were just park attendees. They didn't, they were from Germany, they were from Austria, they were from all over the world. They were just there on their summer vacation and they get out of the heat for an hour to come watch a TV taping. And so I would tell them who to cheer and who to boo, and all of my stuff was off camera. And so, when the wrestlers like in the chin lock, I'm starting to get the clapping going. You know what I mean? And when Disco Inferno would come out, I'd get the crowd chanting "Disco sucks" and all that stuff. And it was just a great atmosphere for TV production because it wasn't
well,
like
that's
you were
really
bribing. You weren't
that
bribing
stayed on for
homeless
a long
people.
time.
Yeah, you weren't bribing homeless people with the
Yeah,
threat of a cold meal to stay there in attendance. You actually had an engaged audience who were bananas for the product but had no idea. So it was a weird departure from everything else that they were producing, but it made for great TV. And one of the other little known things is that Eddie Mansfield was the first one who went to the theme park, went to Universal with the idea of doing this. But he went with two guys that day that Casey knows well. He went with Steve Kern and Mike Graham. And they were talking about bringing Championship Wrestling from Florida back and wanting to produce the shows there. And after they were kind of cool to the idea and about what, because I guess Steve and Mike were like looking for a set amount of money. And Universal was like, we really don't have that in the budget to produce this kind of thing. Eddie stayed behind. And while Kern and Graham were on the outside, he said, I can do this at the price you're looking for. And he basically stole the idea from Kern and Graham. And then Eric Bischoff stole the idea from Eddie Mansfield. So that's kind of how it all, in a timeline perspective, how it all worked. Yes, Eddie was the first to do it.
well,
Kern and
I know
Graham
when
had
they
the
switched
idea.
over. I know when they switched over to Universal for MGM, they allowed in like so many um, people from the outside audience that weren't paid to go into the park. So you would have
Right.
all like the local wrestling fans. So there a match I'm wrestling Scott Norton over the soundtrack. You can hear them cheering my name because I grew up in Orlando. Everyone that was a wrestling fan there knew who I was, and so everyone was cheering for me. And it was like, who are they? I said, yeah, they were cheering for me. It was crazy. I mean, because they just knew who I was because 10 years of being there, you know, wrestling on the indies and stuff like that all the time. They knew who I was. So, they let about 100, 150 of them in, that weren't part of the park and stuff like that.
It was a little harder to draw park goers to Universal into the sound stages because they were slightly detached from the park. Like you had to have an active idea of wanting to go see this TV production because it was over beyond sort of Nickelodeon and it really wasn't on the path like it was at MGM. MGM was much more conducive to getting people to go, but there were times that the soundstage at MGM wasn't available, so they had to go to Universal.
They also did use all of the staff from Disney inside of the soundstage at Universal.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Because I remember once, because they didn't know who was who. I was with one of my buddies. And I'm like, hey, you want to go to the park? We had like an hour offer or something like that. So I went up to one of the girls. I was trying to like big shot it. I'm like, hey, listen, I want to go to one of the parks, but I don't really want anyone to bother me or this or that. I don't have much time. She's like, oh, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. They had 2 people walk with us with the passes. We went to the front of the line before they had the fast passes and everything. Literally did the whole entire park, rode Tower of Terror like 4 times, and was back in 45 minutes. I'm like, this is the greatest thing in the world. She didn't know if I was Hulk Hogan or who I was, but they still just took care of me. It was like, my buddy's like, this is really cool. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. A fan sent in a question for you, Kevin, about the McMahon Hemsley era and the role that you played in that storyline. If you want to talk about that.
Well, it wasn't. It was good to have an open and honest dialogue with Vince, but it turned out to be one of the biggest, mistakes ever, if you think about it. So my wife and I are huge soap opera fans, and at the time in WWF. Stephanie was engaged to Test and they were getting ready to get married. And my wife says in a soap opera, Triple H would find a way to screw over the wedding and interject himself and become married with Stephanie. And so the 2 of us are laying in bed and we're sort of fleshing this out. And it's like, oh my God. Okay. So the next day I go in and I write up the email and it's the whole thing, blah, blah, blah. Stephanie gets dinged somehow, some way, and she's loopy and she doesn't realize that she's marrying Triple H. But it's also, I don't know if you remember the Flintstones episode, Fred's Nightmare of the Little Church. It was that Vince is running and chasing and trying to find out what happened. The camera bursts in because there's a wedding going on. Wait, what? Camera bursts in and we see a long-haired, blonde-haired guy and Stephanie in her bridal gown. And the minister is there, and I now pronounce you man and wife. And Stephanie, kind of loopy, says, you may be the happiest woman in the world. And who we think is Test turns, and it's Triple H. And he says, oh, you have no idea how happy you just made me. And the show would go off the air. And I wrote, how Stephanie would make her comeback and how she would basically throw everybody out of her life, because that's classic soap opera, and become this standalone woman. Well, what we wound up with was Triple H and Stephanie falling in love for real. China getting her heart broken for real, and the business taking a major turn downward because Stephanie was able to get more power within WWF, become the head of the writing team, and Triple H got more power, and it wound up being more good than it was worth in the initial idea. But the way they did it was the way they did it. But Vince's response, and he was the first one that responded to the email. So I copied Vince and Shane and Kevin Dunn and Jim Ross and everybody, as I had done with, probably 20 or 30 other ideas. And Vince was the first one to respond, and it was in all caps. And all it said was, that's great, S. And then Shane, who was in charge of .com at the time, he's down the hall from me. on the second floor of the tower. He comes down to my office and pokes his head in and he goes, dude, that idea is sick. I love it. And so they wound up doing it. They changed it to, their way, but it worked out the same. And, but little do you know when you're messing with real people's relationships, because I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know that this was, this would wind up breaking up Triple H in China. So little did we know that, one of the biggest stories in WWF that affected the industry going forward, and they're still together today with 3 kids, was born out of, my wife and I and our love of soap operas.
So you caused all the real soap opera backstage is what you did.
Yes, I did. And I had no idea. And Joni was a friend of mine and would often ride with me after TV, at least back to the hotel. Because I would always have a car. And if May or Moolah weren't with me or whatever, generally it'd be the makeup lady and Joni. And I would hear, kind of like between the two of them. And I didn't know what was going on, but obviously, all of this was going on. But she had no idea that it was me who launched the idea.
Wow.
Very, very ironic. Kevin, you were named best TV announcer 3 times by the
Woohoo!
Wrestling Observer newsletter, and I have to get your take on another more current sort of dynamic in the business now, and that is, do you believe that, like some of the pundits online, that Dave Meltzer has really lost his mojo, for lack of a better word, because of too close an association with AEW, or are you of a different view? Because his production seems to be the same, but he gets a lot of heat now that he didn't get in the past, at least from the fan base.
Well, I mean, again, the fans are the ones who vote in the Observer poll. That's not a Dave vote. I vote every year for the Hall of Fame. And I never voted for, the year's best because I was, potential nominee. So in terms of that, I say Dave is completely legitimate, but it's a conflict of interest for any journalist to root for any company. And obviously his credibility has taken a big hit. I don't, some people say he's on the AEW payroll. I never saw him at one taping. I never saw him backstage once. I have no idea if that changed, if he was involved, if he's not involved anymore. I don't know. But I'm not an Observer reader. I've always respected Dave for his, especially on the historical retrospectives and things like that, and his knowledge of the business. He and I always got along really well, and he would ask me questions from time to time about what's going on in Japan, and I would give him the, very kayfabe answer, and never told him anything. But again, when you're that close to any one product, it's obvious it's going to. He needed to be asking the tough questions because he knew what tough questions to ask, and he never does.
Mm-hmm.
That rolled right into the presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, I did a seminar last night online with Brutal Bob Evans, and we were talking with a group of hopefuls who are looking to take the next step in their careers. And one guy who's an announcer is also a newsman, and he asked, can a real journalist have journalistic integrity and be involved in wrestling? And I said, you can't be worried about making friends. Journalistic integrity has to be first and foremost, because then you'll lose your credibility that way. And what good are you? You're just another announcer. So you can't be worried about pissing people off to where they won't hire you for a job. You just have to do your job. And if you're a journalist, your job is to tell the story. And we've obviously seen how the American news media has been affected by favoritism and fandom and whatever. And, now they have no credibility and nobody watches it or reads it anymore. And it's the same thing in anything. If you're If you know the questions asked and you know the story, you have to tell the story and you have to ask the questions. And if you don't, people will call you a phony.
Yeah. This one's for Casey then. You mentioned the presidential election. Like, looking at it from over here in Ireland, like we talked to Chuck Coates about this a couple of weeks ago, and I just couldn't believe how influential wrestling has been in this last campaign. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it was definitely if you didn't know better, there's a lot of storylines written into the presidential campaign. It could have been a whole pay-per-view to pay-per-view right there, with Biden dropping out and then Harris like jumping in, and it was just crazy. Two assassination attempts. I mean, made for ready for made for TV movie right there, all written out already.
I
It's
mean,
just
with
gonna
the
happen one day, I'm sure.
what I mean though is the likes of Hulk Hogan getting involved, and obviously we knew Kane would be involved with his political
Yeah,
allegiance.
he's in. Yeah,
Batista and
yeah,
just kind of mad stuff.
Well,
yeah.
The Undertaker is the biggest one that was a departure.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I just think people realize that the country is in such bad shape. I mean, around the world. I mean, how people perceive us over here. That the people that stay neutral, that don't want to say anything because they, like Hogan, finally was like, you know what, I just had enough of it. I gotta, we can't take it getting any worse. So I have to say something to do his part, and that's what a lot of the guys, were doing, because, it's definitely the economy's horrible. I mean, everything's bad,
Well,
so,
look at what happened with me in AEW. What started the ball rolling was Ian Riccaboni, who I thought was my friend, taking the very liberal talking point of, this whole child trafficking thing is a QAnon conspiracy theory. And all I said was, hey, child trafficking is terrible. There's a new movie out about it. You should go watch it. And so he goes on some Discord thing and blabs about it. And I thought he was my friend. And now all of a sudden I'm getting, negative, nasty comments everywhere I turn from people who are against me politically without them really knowing my political stance on anything, because I've never said anything other than child trafficking is bad. I wasn't aware that child trafficking being bad was a political issue, but that's the state of affairs now in the world. And, there's no nuance. There's no conversation. It's you are either with us or you're against us. And certainly as far as the left is concerned, and, as far as anybody who was against me because I'm against child trafficking, they can go to hell. But it affected me negatively. It was the beginning, it was the catalyst that got the ball rolling to me eventually getting canned from AEW.
What was the kind of reaction then? You said this thing kind of started on Discord, so how did it get back? Well, I suppose everything on the internet gets back to the office pretty quickly now, but what kind of conversations were had, if any?
Everybody denied it. Everybody said they didn't know anything about it. I talked to HR, and HR said, well, yeah, it is an issue. What Ian did, we'll talk about it. We'll certainly do something about it. Nothing was ever done. And I don't think they wanted to touch it. I think it had a lot to do as well with CM Punk leaving, but nobody ever had the guts to tell me one way or the other where I stood.
Disappointing. Kevin, to go to your tenure when you were in charge of reviewing the wannabe employee tapes that came in to Stanford, I always wanted to ask you if you have any tapes or performances that stand out the most from a WrestleCrap point of view, or did you discover any gems in there? So two-parted question, please.
Well, Howard Finkel and I would watch the tapes and we'd call it Star Search, because at the time Star Search was still a TV show, and most of it was just blah, but there were a couple of like real gems in there. It's where we found Ron Killings. Terry Taylor and I found Ron Killings. He was part of a tag team in North Carolina, and it was like, well, the partner's no good, but this other guy is really good. We should do something with him. So we contacted him. I had a file drawer in my office of all just gimmicks. Like if they needed midgets or if they needed women or if they needed this or that. I always save those. And so, creative would call me and say, "Hey, Kevin, do you have, we need 2 midgets to be the Dudleys this Monday on Raw in Greensboro." "Oh, yeah, give me 5 minutes. I'll call them." And I had a black midget and I had a white midget, and they were the Dudley boys. So there you go.
Did you
It
run across
was
any of my tapes?
probably.
No, Cornette did.
Yeah. Well, Cornette was before me. And it was where I got all of the enhancement guys for WWF, most of them, because I would make notes of where they were geographically, and it's like, "Hey, good stuff on the tape. We might use you as an extra. So when we're in your area, I'll give you a call a few weeks before, and we'll let you know." And I booked guys all over the country from tapes that they had sent in. Bob Sapp was one who sent a tape in, and I was like, "Oh my God, this guy is amazing. He's 6'6" and he's 330 pounds and he's all muscle and he's this incredible voice. And yeah, he doesn't, he's never wrestled, but we could teach him. That's what we have the developmental system for." And they wanted to pay him like $500 a week. And Bob was like, "That wouldn't even make my car payment." So he went to WCW and signed for a lot more and then became a huge, huge star in Japan. So you never know what you were going to run across when you open the envelope. Some of it was crazy, and a lot of it was gaga and terrible, but some of it were gems, and you had to watch every one of them with an open mind. And I reached out to everybody. I let everybody know. I called Sean Davari while he was in high school. I didn't know he was a high school senior at the time, and he took the call. He was in like third period. "Hey, this is Kevin Kelly from the WWF." And I was like, "Hey, this flying carpet thing you got is really cool. We'll keep you in mind for an extra spot." And I knew all the guys from New York. Like I booked Low Key, and it's where I found the Haas brothers because I was involved with ECWA. And I ran across all the guys that train with Homicide and the SATs and whatever, and Prince Nana and Matt Stryker, and it was just, wherever we were geographically, I always had like a whole laundry list full of guys that I could use.
So you had a more positive experience overall than some of the statements Mr. Cornette made over the years about that particular task.
Well, I mean, again, Jim hated living in Connecticut. So I think a lot of it had to do with that. But
Jim hates leaving his house.
He does. He wants to stay in his house. Guys, I've got to go, but Casey will finish up with you and he'll plug the podcast and tell you all about it. And it's a lot of fun. We just did episode 3 where Casey wrecks, 2 cameras and almost gets fired. So, but I will talk to you guys. I'll talk to you guys another time. Okay.
Yes,
Awesome,
sir.
Kevin.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye, Casey.
I see, Kevin.
So, Casey, it's germane that Kevin had to make the exit because I wanted to ask you specifically. There are a lot of pro wrestling podcasts out there. This one notwithstanding, but how did this come together for you, and what was the motivating factor for it, notwithstanding your friendship with Kevin?
Well, and I knew that when I was thinking, I came up with the concept. I was like, the whole concept is the perspective from the side of, they call us jobbers, they call us enhancement extras. In the end, like I explained in our first episode, I did a job for, say, Hugh Morris. Hugh Morris did the job for Luger, and Luger did the job for Hogan. So it's like a ladder. You keep on going up a ladder. Everyone's doing the job for someone, for the top guy. It was Hogan, NWO over there, Stone Cold, and The Rock, and like that. So we're just all wrestlers. We just have different, positions. So I came with the concept that I wanted to show a perspective of how the way we got treated compared to, say, an over guy, a bigger name got treated. How Hogan would treat me compared to Hogan would treat Sting, or Sting would treat me compared to how he would treat Luger. And then also all the behind the scenes stuff, all the stuff that we've known from working at both the different companies, all combined together. And so I was telling Kevin, I said, is it something? He's like, oh my God. He says, I love it. He's like, and I said, well, the reason I was calling Kevin is because I wanted, to see if you like, I needed a host to keep the flow of the show going.
Yeah.
So, I said, like a young kid trying to get in the business who wants to do it and all that. He's like, man, I would like to do it. I was like, I didn't think he would, I didn't know what had going on or anything. And so, he's like, yeah, let's do it. So we just started just putting it together, and our show prep literally is, hey, we're going live in like, we're taping in like 2 minutes. Um, we're gonna, I might ask you this, or literally 30 seconds. There's no show prep, there's no edit, there's no nothing. It's exactly, everything's raw. We just, and it is what it is. And there's no pulling gun. We're not holding back at all. We're telling the truth from the perspective of when we were there. And right now, we just got done. We did the Monday Night Wars because he was literally in, WWF, and I was in WCW. I was there when they did the live Nitros outside of MGM, when they make the studios. We see all the palm trees. I was there. One of the episodes I was talking about ringing the bell, and I was on the headset, and they say whenever they say ring the bell, just ring the bell, or the referee motions to ring the bell. Like 2 to start, 3 to end, and everyone kept on yelling and yelling and yelling, ring the bell, ring the bell. So I was ringing the bell so many times, and I was the bell was live mic'd into the audio, and so it was going over the play-by-play, so they couldn't hear them because all you could hear was the bell ringing. So needless to say, that was the last time I ever rang the bell on Nitro. So it's all that kind of stuff because we have, just because we're not the top guy in the business doesn't mean we don't have perspective, or we weren't there, and people like to see what's going on. I have a big theory, is like when you go to a concert, where do you want to be? You want to be backstage, right? You want to be where, and you want to be where you can't be. You want to see what's going on behind the scenes, like Howard Stern. For years and years, he always was like, "Oh, I'll just stop talking about." No, the people don't care about what's going on behind the scenes. No, that's what everyone wants to see, and that's what everyone wants to hear about. So that's what we're doing. We're giving them what they're going to hear and see what was behind the scenes that other podcasts don't talk about. They're talking about stuff that's going on, and we don't talk about any current product. We just sit there and just talk and tell stories. We're going to start having guests, and it's going to be all like enhancement guys, jobbers, wrestlers, however you want. We have a list of them. And then we're also going to take guys that, like,
we've got
Edge and
a long list of those guys, Casey.
What's that?
We've got a long list of guys that we've had on who be perceived as enhancement guys as also, but you probably know most of them, but just saying.
But it's they all have a perspective because they're there certain parts of the time. So, and then we're also going to take guys that, say, like someone like Edge, he did jobs on WWF. And so let's hear your journey from being a job guy to headlining WrestleMania. So there's so many different perspectives and avenues that we can. One of them is, there's a match, myself and Rob Van Dam wrestled in a handicap match against Sid, and I think it's mislabeled one, and his name was Matt Burns, was his ring name. I was Mike Casey, there is Matt Burns, and Sid literally came up to both of us afterwards and gave us, I think, like $50 each. He's like, hey, it's not a lot, just get dinner, get something to drink. I appreciate what you guys did for me, because we were taking the craziest bumps that, because not everyone could do Sid's stuff. And when I wrestled Sid so much in WCW, when he first seen me in WWF, he like pulled me all over the place. I want to work him. They're like, no. and he ended up pulling me all the way to Vince. Is like, I want to work him. Like, okay, if you want to, you got him. And this is in one of the episodes. I actually wore, and you don't ever see this. I wrestled twice. I wrestled the Mountie in one match in the beginning, and at the end of the show, I wrestled Sid, because they never changed it. And um, WWF paid you once and for the whole night because they did multiple tapings. WCW pay you each match, so you wanted to wrestle a bunch of times there. You know, so that's how it all came about. So and then I'm like, okay, so when you look at the format sheets, you'll see, say, Sting verse. It'll say, it'll have numbers. Everything's time coded, and they say M&E, music and entrance, Sting verse. It'd be it'll say in ring slash. And they just write your name in. So that's where the name came up, in ring, and then just the wrestling podcast. So and so that's just the perspective from our eyes, what we seen, because we were there, during a lot of pivotal parts of wrestling history. And so we have perspectives, and we just share it every week.
That's a really interesting concept, and one that on Cheap Heat Productions here we've interviewed a lot of enhancement guys. And before we find out where the fans can check out your podcast, I wanted to get your opinion on this because you're extremely well qualified. And that is, do you think that we're moving towards a time when the fans, all of the fans now basically are smart, but do you think we're moving towards a time when the crucial role of the enhancement guy, the jobber, the carpenter, what have you, will be recognized in a Hall of Fame capacity for the contributions that you're just laying out right now to the business, when the product was it's a different product, but still that role seems to be getting more and more appreciated. Do you see that ever being a Hall of Fame situation in the future?
Honestly, no. No, which is a shame, because there's guys out there that are Hall of Fame wrestlers, and I said it in a couple of our podcasts. Some of the best wrestlers are the guys that are looking up at the lights. You know, how many agents that come up to me and say, "Hey, can you make them look good for me?" You know, and they're the ones making back then 150, 250,000 a year, and I'm making 150 bucks for that, and they're asking me to make him look good. You know, so unfortunately, I don't see it. I mean, maybe something changes, but I don't think on any big scale. Yeah, could there be one at like a local, regional, or someone, one of their Hall of Fames or something like that? But I don't think, fortunately, they would have anything like that at the WWE level or anything like that. They're gonna have a celebrity wing, but they're not gonna have the guys who made their guys look like $1 million.
Has Snoop Dogg been inducted to the WWE Hall of Fame yet? No doubt he's going to go in, isn't he?
I would imagine so. I mean, we got politicians, we got comedians, we have everyone in there.
Well, hopefully with shows like yours with Mr. Kelly, this tide will turn. Before we let you go, can you let the fans know where and when to find your podcast?
It's on YouTube right now. It's on YouTube. It's going to be on everywhere soon, Spotify and Apple and all that. Just we just kind of just jumped on and said, let's just go, and then we're kind of put the cart before the horse, and so we're playing catch up. But we're on YouTube every week right now. Usually, we go every week, every Sunday on YouTube. It's In Ring Podcast. I'm sorry, I have to write it down because I can never remember it. In Ring Wrestling Podcast, and we film every Sunday at 2:00, and then we upload it right after it. Last week we did it live. We're kind of playing around, putting on all of our different stuff, just kind of playing and seeing what works for us the best, and just kind of trial and error and seeing what is the right niche for us. But we do them Sunday afternoons, and then we upload it right after it. So, but at In-Ring Wrestling Podcast. And all the social media, Facebook's the same thing. There's a Facebook group, Instagram, Twitter. I think it's at in.ring wrestling or X. TikTok, it's the same thing. All In-Ring Wrestling Podcast.
Well, that's great. And we would encourage the fans to check that out. And on behalf of Morris, I want to thank yourself and Kevin for joining us tonight. We'll definitely keep in touch and on top of the progress of your show. So congratulations and thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate you guys bringing us on, talking to you a little bit, and letting us plug our podcast also. And we enjoy watching yours as well.
We'll do it again soon.
All right. Thank you. You guys have a great night.
You too, man.
Well, fans, that's it for another edition of the Cheap Heat Productions Pro Wrestling Podcast. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification so you don't miss the great content coming from this channel. And if you like the video, please give a thumbs up. Until next time, take care, everybody.
Thank you very much for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel if at all possible. It would really help me out. And don't forget, you can check